Hey there YouTube, welcome to Big Mike Beard Wisdom. So today, we'll be tackling the rear end of the Astra, be more specific, the rear shocks. So when I first purchased this, I could see down inside of here that the rear shock looked not super great. And it also looked like it was leaking. So we'll get this jacked up and take a better look at it. Here's the passenger side. And as you can see, it still has like a little bit of the residue left, but there really isn't much. So once your shocks go and the residue, the oil leaks out of it, they're not always going to look oily. Eventually they'll dry back off and there won't be any sign that your shocks are bad except for the ride. And if you're new to the car, you may not know that the ride's particularly bad. Now, if you've got a strut set up, I'd highly recommend, unless you've got the tools to do struts, not to try them at home. But this being a set of shocks, they're not that bad normally. And the keys to this is essentially you want to support this frame section. That way the spring isn't able to unload all the way. Because right now the major stopping factor is the shock. So by putting a jack underneath, you'll stop the spring from fully unloading and having a problem. The big problem I'm facing right now though is that giant E-Torx. Well, that giant E-Torx. Different cars, different manufacturers, different countries like their particular fasteners. This is an E-Torx. So it's basically an external Torx. And they can be kind of a pain. So you can't get a normal socket on it, or you'll strip it out, which is where things like these come in handy. So this wrench set is pretty cool because it's designed to work with a whole bunch of different types. And one of the things that it's designed to work with are E-Torx. So as you can see, it has a good contact pattern and should work for this application. At least for the top one. Bottom one's a little different size. So running the bigger 16mm on that one. I've already slightly loosened up this one. That one's not very tight. This one on the other hand is a bit of a bear. And I hit it with a little bit of penetrating oil to help hopefully loosen it up. Like I said before, you want to make sure that you've got a jack or something underneath this. That way it stops the spring from fully releasing all its energy. Basically stopping it from extending. So I've got the jack underneath the pad down there. And then we'll go ahead and remove the shock. Here's the old shock and the new shock side by side. And basically you can see how rusty the old one was. There's a slight difference in the new ones. So it looks almost like this head piece here is a little bit bigger with maybe a little bit more insulation around it. Down here looks to be about the same size. And then you want to check real quick that the bolts still go in. Because it's possible that the shocks are, you know, of similar appearance, but if the holes are ever different, it might be that you got the wrong shock. And these were actually a manufacturer closeout on Rock Auto, so they were pretty cheap. And they came with fun instructions as to how to dispose of the shock. So put it in a vise, drill the hole in it, let the gas escape, drain the oil out, throw it away, or maybe that's recycle it with other metal parts. None of this is in English. So, but fun cartoon nonetheless. And then with it being slightly different, I just want to make sure that there isn't any kind of issue up here. So I'm going to make sure that it slides in real easy and there's plenty of room around it, which seems like it's good. Yep, so it's got enough room to go too high and then come back down in. So we should be good. And we just slap the bolts back in, tighten her up. And then now that the shock's installed and tightened down, you can go ahead and relieve pressure on the jack. See the jack going down? So slowly. And we should be good to go work on the other side. Which is pretty much the same thing as this side. Just in reverse. Whenever you're working on your own stuff, there's hard ways and easy ways to do everything. And some ways that makes breaking loose bolts a little bit easier is basically to let gravity help you. So normally you can pull down more easily than you can drive up. So if this was on this side and you were forcing it up, you might have a harder time trying to take it loose. Come on, get back on there. There's plenty of times to use the work harder, but work smarter, not harder. And this is one of them. And a good way to think of your shocks is that your springs hold your car up off the ground. Your shocks hold your wheels on the ground. So as you're going down the road, you hit a bump, your shock slows the movement. That way, instead of it jumping way up after the bump, it slows that movement down. That way the tires are able to come to the ground faster. A lot of times, whenever you torque down a suspension component, you want to torque it down while the vehicle's at ride height. So an easy trick is to essentially, while you have this underneath the spring, go ahead and jack it up just a little bit more until it just starts to relieve a little bit of pressure on that jack stand. And by just relieving a little bit of pressure on the jack stand, you've got the vehicle up in the air where it's easy to tighten everything up and wait on that suspension with the suspension partially loaded. Because once you get it down on the ground, wheels on it, it can be really tough to get to the bolts. Now this is a step some people do, some people don't. It's one of those things that's widely recommended, if not directly in the instructions for how to do things. But I can almost guarantee you probably 90% of suspension repairs don't get this. And an easy way to see why is essentially, here's the wheel, there's the bolt for the lower shock. There isn't a straight shot to it until you start getting inside the wheel. And then that greatly reduces your ability to apply torque. I just got back from a test drive and the shocks are interesting. So depending on what type of shocks you have and depending on what kind of car you have and depending on the shocks that you had before, you're gonna have maybe a different outcome than you thought. So the Astra, especially the 3-doors, are kind of a more of a performance-y kind of suspension, especially with the wheels and tires too. They should relatively handle well. A good handling car though tends to be one that maybe rides a little bit rough, and I think the 3-doors even had like a sport handling package, which might be firmer shocks. So going from the old blown out shocks to these shocks, little bit of a stiffer ride. So essentially with these it felt a little bit smoother. With the new ones I can feel bumps more, and I do notice a little bit of a difference, kind of like when you take like the heading into and coming out of a corner and stuff like that. That feels a little bit differently as well. All in all, I'm glad that I did change the shocks, because at least now I know what I should be expecting from the car as far as handling goes. And then hopefully nothing else breaks for a while. So, hope you guys liked the video. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll check you next time. You could almost say the results were shocking. Alright, maybe it's not funny.